Long before the first shot was ever fired, the American Civil War was already being written, not in blood, but in compromises, contradictions, and broken promises. The United States of America was born with a fatal flaw buried deep within its founding documents. A nation that declared all men are created equal had, from its very first breath, built its economy on the backs of enslaved human beings. The Founding Fathers knew it. Many of them owned slaves themselves. Thomas Jefferson, the man who wrote those immortal words about equality, owned over 600 enslaved people over the course of his lifetime. The contradiction was glaring, uncomfortable, and deliberately left unresolved. They hoped, perhaps naively, that slavery would simply fade away on its own. It did not. Instead, it grew. And as America grew, so did the tension between two very different worlds sharing one nation. By the early 1800s, the United States had split into two distinct economic and cultural identities. In the North, cities were booming, factories were rising, immigration was surging. The Northern economy was powered by industry, commerce, and free labor. Workers were paid wages. Towns were growing. A new middle class was emerging. In the South, the world looked very different. The economy ran almost entirely on agriculture. Vast plantations of cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane stretching across the landscape as far as the eye could see. And powering every single one of those plantations was enslaved labor. By 1860, there were nearly 4 million enslaved people in the American South. They were bought and sold like livestock. They were separated from their families without a second thought. They were beaten, brutalized, and worked to exhaustion under the blazing sun. The South did not see this as a moral failing. They called it their peculiar institution and defended it fiercely. To the Southern planter class, slavery was not just an economic necessity. It was a way of life, a social order, a foundation upon which their entire civilization rested. And so two Americas existed side by side, one marching toward the future, one clinging desperately to the past. As the United States expanded westward, every new territory added to the nation became a battleground for the soul of America. Would new states be free or slave? A series of uneasy compromises held the nation together, barely. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, each one kicked the problem a little further down the road. Each one frayed the rope a little more. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was perhaps the most explosive. It allowed settlers in new territories to vote on whether to allow slavery. The result was chaos. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers poured into Kansas, each trying to outnumber the other. Violence erupted, towns were burned, people were killed. The press called it Bleeding Kansas. It was a preview of the war to come. Meanwhile, a new political party was rising in the North. The Republican Party, founded in 1854, stood firmly against the expansion of slavery. In the midst of all this turmoil, one man was quietly making a name for himself on the political stage. Abraham Lincoln was born in a log cabin in Kentucky in 1809. He grew up in poverty, moving with his family to Indiana and later Illinois. He had almost no formal education, less than a year of schooling in total. But Lincoln had something more valuable than any classroom could offer. He had an insatiable hunger to learn. He taught himself to read. He borrowed books and read them by firelight late into the night. He studied law on his own and became one of the most respected lawyers in Illinois. He was tall, lean, and awkward-looking, with a voice that carried across a courtroom, and a wit that disarmed his opponents before they even knew what hit them. In 1860, the Republican Party nominated Abraham Lincoln for President of the United States. The 1860 presidential election was unlike any in American history. Lincoln didn't even appear on the ballot in most southern states, and yet he won. The reaction in the South was immediate and furious. South Carolina called a special convention, and on December 20th, 1860, voted to secede from the United States of America. Within months, 10 more states followed. In February 1861, they formed the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as their president. On March 4, 1861, Abraham Lincoln delivered his first inaugural address. His words were firm but measured. He would not be the aggressor, but he would not allow the Union to be dissolved. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. On April 12, 1861, at 4:30 in the morning, Confederate artillery opened fire on Fort Sumter. For 34 hours, the bombardment continued. The Civil War had begun. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. Men across the North answered enthusiastically, expecting a short war. Jefferson Davis called for 100,000 Confederate volunteers. Both sides were dangerously wrong about how short this war would be. The Confederacy held significant advantages. They were fighting a defensive war on their own soil with highly motivated troops and brilliant commanders. Men like Robert E. Lee, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, and James Longstreet. The Union held larger advantages in the long run, a population of 22 million, factories, railroads, and the industrial capacity to wage a prolonged war. On July 21, 1861, Union and Confederate forces clashed near a small stream called Bull Run in northern Virginia. Civilians from Washington drove out in carriages to watch, expecting a Union triumph. What they witnessed instead was a rout. Stonewall Jackson held his line so firmly under withering fire that a fellow officer cried out, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall." The Union Army streamed back toward Washington in panic and disorder. The illusion of a short war died at Bull Run. Lincoln faced opposition from every direction. His first commanding general, Winfield Scott, was too old and ill to lead effectively. He was replaced by George McClellan, a brilliant organizer but a commander paralyzed by caution. McClellan built the Army of the Potomac into a formidable fighting machine and then refused to use it. Lincoln grew increasingly frustrated. At one point, he reportedly said, "If General McClellan does not want to use the army, I would like to borrow it for a time." Meanwhile, out in the Western Theater, a different kind of general was making his mark. Ulysses S. Grant was not glamorous. He was not polished. But Grant fought. At Fort Donelson in February 1862, Grant demanded unconditional surrender, earning him the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. At the brutal Battle of Shiloh in April 1862, Grant's army was nearly overwhelmed by a surprise Confederate attack, but held on and counterattacked ferociously, driving the Confederates from the field. In the spring of 1862, McClellan finally moved his massive army by sea to the Virginia Peninsula and began a slow advance on Richmond. But McClellan moved with agonizing slowness. And then in June 1862, Robert E. Lee took command of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. Lee was everything McClellan was not: aggressive, bold, creative, and utterly fearless. Despite having a smaller army, Lee launched a series of fierce attacks, the 7 Days battles that sent McClellan reeling back. Richmond was saved. The Peninsula Campaign had failed. In September 1862, Robert E. Lee invaded the North, but fate intervened. A Union soldier discovered a copy of Lee's battle plans wrapped around 3 cigars, lost in a field. The two armies met at Antietam Creek near Sharpsburg, Maryland, on September 17, 1862. What followed was the single bloodiest day in American military history. Nearly 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing in a single day of fighting. The cornfields ran red. The dead lay in rows. Lee was forced to retreat back into Virginia. 5 days after Antietam, on September 22, 1862, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Effective January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in Confederate states would be declared forever free. It transformed the war. What had been a war to preserve the Union was now explicitly a war to end slavery. For the 4 million enslaved men, women, and children in the South, it was a beacon of hope, unlike anything they had ever known. The war ground on through 1863 with staggering violence. In the West, Grant laid siege to Vicksburg, Mississippi for 47 days. On July 4, 1863, Vicksburg surrendered. The Mississippi River was now entirely in Union hands. The Confederacy had been cut in two. At Chancellorsville in May 1863, Robert E. Lee achieved perhaps his greatest tactical victory, defeating a Union army more than twice the size of his own. But it came at a terrible price. Stonewall Jackson was accidentally shot by his own men and died 8 days later. Lee said of his irreplaceable lieutenant, "He has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right arm." Undaunted, Lee launched a second invasion of the North. His army swept into Pennsylvania in late June 1863. The town of Gettysburg had no particular strategic importance. But on July 1st, 1863, advance elements of both armies stumbled into each other on its outskirts, and a battle neither side had planned became the turning point of the entire war. For 3 days, more than 160,000 men fought in the fields and hills around Gettysburg. On the third day, Lee launched Pickett's charge. Nearly 12,500 Confederate soldiers marched across nearly a mile of open field directly into withering Union fire. More than half were killed, wounded, or captured in less than an hour. Lee watched the shattered remnants of his army limp back and said, "It is all my fault." On July 4th, 1863, Lee began his retreat back to Virginia. He would never invade the North again. Lincoln finally found his general. In March 1864, he appointed Ulysses S. Grant as commander of all Union armies. Grant's strategy was simple and brutal. Use the North's overwhelming advantage in men and resources to grind the Confederacy down until nothing was left. In the East, Grant relentlessly pursued Lee through the wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor, battles of horrifying ferocity. Grant kept moving forward. He would not stop. In the West, General William Tecumseh Sherman led his army deep into the Confederate heartland. In September 1864, Sherman captured Atlanta. He then began his infamous March to the Sea, cutting a 60-mile-wide path of destruction through Georgia to Savannah, deliberately targeting the South's ability to make war. In November 1864, Abraham Lincoln won re-election in a landslide. At his second inauguration in March 1865, Lincoln spoke words that would echo through history. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds. By April 1865, the end was near. Grant had pinned Lee's dwindling army in Petersburg, Virginia for 9 months. On April 2nd, 1865, the Confederate lines finally broke. Richmond fell that same night. On April 9th, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The terms were generous. Grant ordered his men not to cheer. These men are our countrymen again. The Civil War was over. After 4 years of fighting, the United States had lost approximately 620,000 soldiers, more than in any other war in American history before or since. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in December 1865, formally abolished slavery throughout the United States forever. But freedom is not the same as equality. The 4 million men, women, and children who had been enslaved emerged from bondage with nothing. No land, no money, no education, no legal protections. Abraham Lincoln never got the chance to help answer what freedom would truly mean. On April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. A Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln in the back of the head. Lincoln died the following morning. He was 56 years old. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton stood at Lincoln's bedside and said quietly, "Now he belongs to the ages." The American Civil War was the defining event of the 19th century, a cataclysm that reshaped the nation from its foundations. It ended the institution of slavery. It settled once and for all the question of whether a state could leave the Union. But it also left wounds that would take generations to heal. The struggle for true equality that Lincoln gave his life to advance continued long after the guns fell silent. The Civil War reminds us that progress is never free. It is purchased at enormous cost by ordinary men and women who are willing to stand up for what is right, even when it is dangerous, even when it is hard, even when the outcome is uncertain. We owe it to all of them to understand what happened, why it happened, and what it still means today.